The biggest wealth transfer in American history has begun. History rarely moves in a straight line. Instead, it moves in massive, tectonic shifts that remain invisible to those living through them, until the ground beneath their feet has already moved miles from where it once stood. We are standing at the precipice of such a shift as silent, mathematical inevitability that is currently reorganizing the very fabric of the global social contract. While the headlines focus on the volatility of the stock market or the latest geopolitical skirmish, a much deeper and more permanent phenomenon is unfolding. The greatest transfer of wealth in the history of human civilization. Over the next 2 decades, an estimated $84 trillion will change hands in the United States alone. Moving from the hands of the silent generation and the baby boomers into the accounts of millennials and Gen Z. But to view this merely as a massive inheritance is to miss the darker, more complex reality of the mechanism at play. This is not simply a story of family legacies and passed-down homes. It is the story of a fundamental realignment of the American economy. Driven by the collision of unprecedented debt, the systematic debasement of the currency, and a structural shift in how value is stored and protected, we are witnessing the liquidation of the post-World War II middle class, where the wealth built through decades of industrial dominance and stable monetary policy is being sucked into a vacuum of asset inflation and institutional consolidation. The great wealth transfer is often marketed as a coming windfall for the youth, but beneath the surface, it is a desperate race against a system that is devaluing the very dollars being inherited faster than they can be spent. The stakes of this transition involve the total reconfiguration of the American dream for nearly 70 years. The primary vehicle for wealth creation in the West was the combination of a stable manufacturing base, a high-yield savings environment, and affordable property ownership. This was the era of the Great Compression, where the gap between the wealthy and the working class narrowed, and a vast majority of the population could participate in the growth of the nation. However, that era has effectively ended. We have transitioned from an economy based on production and savings to one based on debt and asset appreciation. In this new landscape, wealth is no longer earned through labor alone. It is captured by those who own the hardest assets, real estate equities, and scarce commodities, while those who rely on a traditional salary find themselves on a treadmill that is accelerating backward. The $84 trillion figure represents more than the total GDP of the world's leading economies combined. It is a sum so large that its movement will dictate the fate of entire industries. If managed correctly, this transfer could represent a renewal of the American entrepreneurial spirit. If managed poorly, or if swallowed by the mounting pressures of national debt, it will represent the final consolidation of wealth into the hands of a technocratic elite. To understand why this transfer is happening now, we must travel back to the summer of 1944 to a secluded hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. It was here that delegates from 44 nations designed a system where the US dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, making it the world reserve currency for nearly 3 decades. This provided the most stable period of economic growth in human history. The wealth being transferred today was largely built during this golden age, when the dollar was as good as gold and the American worker was the most productive on earth. But by 1971, the system hit a wall. To pay for social programs in the Vietnam War, the government printed more dollars than it had gold to back. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon temporarily suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. This was the birth of the modern fiat era. Overnight, the dollar went from being a receipt for a commodity to a piece of paper backed solely by faith and credit. This decoupling allowed for an explosion of credit, fueling the rise of boomer-era wealth through debt-driven expansion. However, it also set the stage for systematic devaluation. The wealth currently being transferred is denominated in a currency that has lost over 85% of its purchasing power since 1971. We are inheriting millions, but those millions by far less than they did for the generation that earned them. To truly grasp the mechanics of this transfer, one must understand the relationship between debt and inflation. In a debt-based monetary system, inflation is not a bug, it is a feature. It is the silent mechanism by which a government reduces the weight of its debt. However, this comes at the direct expense of the middle class. When the Federal Reserve pumps liquidity into the system, that money does not distribute evenly. This is known as the Cantillon Effect. Those closest to the source of the money banks. Hedge funds and large corporations receive the new capital first, before prices have risen. By the time that money trickles down to the average citizen in the form of wages, the prices of assets like houses and stocks have already been bid up. This is the hidden trap within the great wealth transfer. While the nominal value of the inheritance, the number on the screen's increasing, the real wealth is being squeezed by asset inflation. Since the early 1970s, the price of homes and education has decoupled from median income. While a boomer could buy a home for 3 times their annual salary, the next generation faces a ratio of 8 to 10 times. The transfer is, in many ways, a catch-up mechanism that still fails to bridge the gap created by 50 years of currency debasement. While families prepare for this inheritance, a more silent and powerful force is intercepting that wealth before it can be used to build a new middle class. We are seeing the rise of a new institutionalism. Organizations like BlackRock, Vanguard, and massive private equity firms have realized that in a world of devaluing currency, yield is no longer found in bonds, it is found in the basic necessities, housing and land. This is why Wall Street firms are outbidding individual families for single-family homes with all-cash offers. They are not just buying houses, they're buying the future cash flows of the American population. This institutional capture is driven by an elite incentive structure that prioritizes asset under management over actual economic productivity. Because these institutions have direct access to cheap money from the Federal Reserve's lending facilities. They can borrow at rates the average millennial cannot dream of. They use this leverage to buy the assets the younger generation is waiting to inherit. The result is a paradox. The next generation may inherit more dollars than any generation in history, but they will find themselves living in a world where the cost of entry into the ownership class has been artificially inflated beyond their reach. The acceleration of this transfer reached a breaking point in the early 2020s. The response to global crises triggered a monetary expansion of such magnitude that it dwarfed previous records. Within a short span, the M2 money supply in the United States increased by nearly 40%. This pulled future inflation into the present, shortening the timeline for the great wealth transfer. We are no longer talking about a slow transition. We are talking about a decade of intense, violent reorganization. As we move through 2026, the global de-dollarization movement adds a new layer of risk. If global demand for the dollar drops while the U.S. government continues to run multi-trillion-dollar deficits, the only outcome is a domestic inflationary firestorm. In this scenario, the $84 trillion being transferred won't just be moving between accounts, it will be melting. History tells us that in every instance where a reserve currency began to lose its global grip, from the British pound in the 1940s to the Dutch guilder in the 1700s, the domestic population experienced a massive real wealth contraction, even as their nominal wealth hit record highs. The big truth of the great wealth transfer is this: it is not a windfall. It is a liquidation event, It is the process of the 20th century middle-class model being dissolved to pay for the debts of the 21st century state. The system is currently harvesting the stored labor of the boomer generation, stored in their home equity and retirement accounts, to keep the over-leveraged financial system from imploding. Every time the government prints money to save the market, they are effectively reaching into the future purchasing power of your inheritance and spending it today. Wealth is never truly lost in an economy. It is only moved. If it is moving out of the hands of families, it is moving into the balance sheets of the institutions and the sovereign debt of the state. The American dream was built on a specific set of monetary conditions, specifically, stable money that no longer exist. To survive the transfer, one cannot rely on the old rules of saving in a bank account. Those rules were designed for a world that Nixon ended in 1971. In the new geometry of wealth, the only protection is the ownership of scarce hard assets that cannot be printed or taxed into oblivion. We stand at a crossroads that every great civilization has eventually faced. The numbers are clear, the historical parallels are undeniable, and the mechanism is already in motion. The $84 trillion transfer is the final chapter of a story that began at Bretton Woods and reached its climax in the printing presses of the modern era. It is a story of how a nation's prosperity was borrowed from its future, and how that future has finally arrived to collect its due. As the baton passes from one generation to the next, the question isn't how many dollars you will receive. The question is, what will those dollars be worth, and who will own the world you are trying to buy with them? History tells us that the transition will be painful, but it also tells us that those who see the pattern before it is complete are the ones who will define the next era. The ground is moving. The transfer has begun. The only thing left to decide is whether you will be a casualty of this shift or one of the few who understands the new geometry of wealth.